This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from SupChina. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and just like my father used to say, never trust an electrician with no eyebrows. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and wishes he could have gotten bitten by a radioactive confident person. You probably know a bit about Chinese surnames, but in this episode, John and I will discuss how they relate to both Chinese culture and language acquisition, plus how they can even help you forge new relationships in Chinese. Guest interviews with Chris Marquis of the Chinese Corner Office podcast and business professor from Cornell University specializing in China. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah, United States.
Hey guys, I'm John Pasden. I am in Shanghai, China. How's it going?
All right, Johnny, we have got quite the episode ahead of us. What's in a name? But before we get to that, let's do our reviews.
All right, we do have some reviews. I am going to do the first one. This one is from Condra5 on Apple Podcasts in the US. So she says, 5 stars, very helpful. So many different ideas on how to make the most out of practice and very encouraging to keep going. Well, thank you, Condra. Short and sweet. We appreciate the review. We could use more, everybody. But thanks so much, Condra. Keep going. Jared, you have another one?
This one comes from Roy Boy from Australia. He says, 5 stars, the motivation to keep going. I stumbled on the You Can Learn Chinese podcast just over a year ago and found it to be the motivation I needed to keep on going with my studies. Not a word of Chinese is spoken, well, very little, but still I come out at the end learning so much. Not only that, but the links to the resources in the podcast have led me to the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, and Chinese Pod, where it was great to find John's voice still around after many years. Hey, John, you still got a voice.
All right. Yeah.
If you are like me and study mainly alone, i.e. not at the uni group study method, then I highly recommend this podcast. When you're feeling a bit lost and don't want to pick up that book or go to the online course, an hour of John and Jared will have you re-energized and on your way. Oh, and J&J, as others have asked, I will ask my wish. Look forward to the first level 3 book when you can, thumbs up, and thoroughly enjoy Jekyll and Hyde with my tutor. All right, Roy Boy, we appreciate that. And John, he's asking about our level 3 books. What should we say?
Roy Boy, thanks for the praise and thank you for the question. So level 3 books, the more level 2 we release, the better we can create a level 3 standard which builds on the previous levels. So, the more books we make, the better we get at it. And for sure, we want our level 3 books to be the best they can be. So we're building towards that. It is coming.
And right now, I am working on the plot for our next level 2 book, right?
All right.
And if you have a review or you have a comment or a question for us, be sure to go drop us a review on iTunes. It really helps us out. Or you can send us an email at feedback@mandarincompanion.com, and we'll give you a shout out here on the podcast.
Okay, so today we want to talk about Chinese names. Now, obviously, Chinese names work a little bit different from English names. If you're learning Chinese, you might want to choose a Chinese name. We talked about that back in episode 35 back in the day. But Chinese names, it's about more than just the structure of the names. There are actually a lot of other interesting cultural and personal things connected. And knowing a little bit about names can really help your studies go a lot farther. So this might be surprising to you, but just focusing on Chinese people's names a bit can really help you out in learning Chinese.
Yes, and the name aspect in Chinese is really deep. And we're definitely going to probe some of those depths here in this show today. So stay tuned. This is going to be a fun discussion.
All right, so we'll start with the easy stuff that you probably already know. This isn't going to be the meat of the discussion, but we'll just get it out of the way. So you probably know that in China, a person's name starts with their surname, which we often call last name in English, and then it's followed by their given name.
So a little backwards for most of us who are listening to this podcast.
Are they backwards, Jared, or are we backwards? Huh?
That's a good question, John. But I'm just curious, as a side note, what other languages and cultures have used that order? Like family
Japanese.
Name, given name. Japanese. Is Korean like that?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. So Seems to be a characteristic of Asia. I'm sure there's other cultures as well. Maybe there's somewhere in Africa or other languages too. But yeah, that's definitely the model.
All right, so I often use the word surname because when you say last name, it's kind of assumes a certain order. So most Chinese surnames are one character. There are some rare Chinese surnames that are two characters, but most people's full name is a one-character surname followed by one or two characters in their given name.
Yeah, this was something that it just took me a while to get used to. And on this aspect, if you remember that, most people have just a two-character name, at most three. And as you said, there could be that rare individual that has a two-character last name. So when you're actually addressing people, if you think about it, like if someone has the name is just Joe or John, it's just a one-syllable name. But in English and many other languages, people have multiple syllables in their name. But in Chinese, this goes a little further because it's very common when you address someone, but you address them by their family name and their given name. So it'd be like, John, if I were to call you all the time, hey, John Pasden. Hey, John Pasden, what do you think about this? John Pasden. Hey, John Pasden, can you make a comment on that? Sounds a little weird, doesn't it?
All right, but there are some patterns there. There's like your surname, if it's one character, and then your given name is one character, then you're most often going to hear the full name used. Whereas if the given name is two characters, you're often going to hear people calling them by just their given name. So, for example, the name is Fan Bingbing, then often people will just call her Bingbing.
I remember my first job in China. I was working in market research, and my boss, his name was Zheng Yang. And it was like, I didn't feel comfortable calling him Zheng Yang. It just seemed weird to me to call him by, his both names. But that's just what everyone called him. That was normal. I thought for a second, maybe I should call him Yang. But I quickly learned that also just sounded weird, right? It's like you don't do that. And so usually you're going to refer to someone in a name that has two syllables. That's usually the norm.
Right. And of course, in China, there's also this convention where you use a Lao for someone who's older that you want to respect. So you might call someone Lao Zheng. Or if they're younger than you might call them Xiao Zheng. So again, that makes it a two-syllable thing. That's kind of the preference in Chinese.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of other terms to address people like that too. For example, the shopkeeper, you can call him Laoban. But if you know his last name, it's like Zhang, you go with Zhang Laoban. Or there's a lot of other titles like that you can use in China. And it's just totally normal.
Right. So that's the basic background. You probably know this if you've had like at least a year of Chinese. But there's some other stuff, some linguistic knowledge, which I think really adds a lot to the full picture for learning Chinese long term. So specifically, you might know that in Chinese, there are not that many surnames that you will frequently come across. In fact, there are 100 surnames in Chinese that make up 85% of the surnames of the entire population. That's kind of crazy. In fact, it's the opposite of what we have in the U.S. In the U.S., we have all these crazy surnames coming from different countries all over the world. And if you look at the stats, it is super scattered. Whereas our given names are kind of standard. Like, John is a common name you might know. Whereas in China, even though there are relatively few surnames that are used by most of the population, the given names are just like all over the place. You can just make up your own name.
That is so true. That is so true. And, I think the way I always explain this to a lot of people who have questions about this is that, well, if you want to come up with a new name in English, well, you can just make up a name, right? You can combine letters. You can make up just a name that doesn't even exist. So, and you can do that. But in Chinese, how are you going to do that? You're just going to make up a new character? It doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah, and you'll find also that if you try to make up a name in English, it's not nearly as easy as you might think. Like someone who's learning English will try to make one up and you'll just be like, yeah, don't use that. It's just not that easy. There are all these rules that we don't even know we know.
And there's this term in Chinese called 老百姓. And that means what the old 100 names, right? So that's just kind of it's a term for just the common folk, the common people, but it's kind of just a little bit of I guess, tongue in cheek, just also a little bit play on words, saying that, hey, there's like only 100 surnames in Chinese.
And of those 100, the surnames Wang, Li, Zhang, Liu, and Chen make up 30% of the population. That's kind of crazy when you think about it.
That's a lot.
433 million people at the time of this paper that I'm citing. So yeah, it's crazy. Now, how does this relate to learning Chinese? This is kind of important. The good news is if you know most of these 100 surnames, then you actually know most of the surnames you're going to come across when you're reading or when you meet somebody. So it's not like English where like anything can be a surname. But in Chinese, you kind of need this because, when you're reading, there's no spaces between the words, right? So you have to just get good at recognizing names because there's no capital letters, there's no spaces. You just have to kind of know that that's a name. So this is actually a really important part of your Chinese reading knowledge. You need to learn these surnames. You don't have to learn them all right away, but there's only 100. So it's something that you do want to kind of keep on your radar. And for example, if you have a Chinese teacher and your Chinese teacher tells you, oh, call me Jane, call me Vivian, call me Sunny, it's actually not a good idea because you want to get used to these Chinese surnames. If your Chinese teacher's last name is Xu, maybe it's a little hard to pronounce at first, but just keep practicing it. Always call your teacher Xu Lao Shi, and you're practicing that vocabulary that you need to learn.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's been reading Chinese or attempted to read Chinese for any length of time, you can absolutely remember a time where you were reading something and you came across some characters or a word or something that you didn't know and you were trying to figure it out, and then you eventually realized, oh, this is a name, right?
I've been there so many times. It's so frustrating back in the beginning.
But, John, as you said, right, it's really important that as you start collecting and recognizing these common surnames, it's much easier to spot. And so if you see Wang and then something and it doesn't make sense to you, then you're like, oh, wait a second. And then you look at the context and you realize, oh, hey, mate, that's actually a word. But yeah, the sooner you can start learning those surnames is really helpful.
Now, we're not saying you should memorize this list of 100 surnames ASAP. I hope if you've been listening for a while, you realize that we're not advocating just memorizing word lists, but it just is something that you want to keep track of and just don't totally ignore. And if your teacher isn't having you use his or her Chinese name, then start using it.
Now, I guess, John, a little plug on the Mandarin Companion side, but this is something we do pay attention to in our books.
Yeah, so we purposely use only common surnames, and then for Breakthrough, it's both common surnames that are used with common characters. There is one exception, and that is, you know what it is, Jared?
No, actually. Who is it?
All right, you forgot. It's My Teacher is a Martian book.
Oh,
we purposely use two surnames, which are really easy characters, but they don't commonly appear as surnames. They're not in that list of 100 because, I don't want to give any spoilers, but let's just say these two teachers are special. So they got special surnames. I don't want to give away any spoilers. The title of the book is kind of a spoiler. But anyway, so remember, if your teacher's name is hard to pronounce, if your teacher has spent time abroad, they're probably used to helping out foreigners that can't pronounce their name. But if you're learning Chinese, you got to practice it. So, don't let your teacher go easy on you. Practice that pronunciation.
And John, this is actually wonderful advice. If anyone out there, if they've ever read, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, one of the points he brings out in that book is that use people's names. It's the sweetest sound to them, right? So when someone actually is using your proper name and trying or hopefully pronouncing it well, it turns your head. You feel a bit of a connection towards that individual. So yeah, learning Chinese names will open doors for you, especially even just trying. Even the fact you bring up a good example. I do know a lot of Chinese here who in America now they're just using their English name and that's all they use it. But if you actually try their Chinese name, they appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
Although I will say, John, I do know some individuals in China where I've actually known them for years. I don't even know their Chinese name. They won't I remember one of my jobs had this guy his name was George Zhang, and he was only known by George, and his English was terrible, right? But he went by George, and nobody at the company, he was one of our clients, nobody at the company knew his real Chinese name. It was just
you mean even George. The Chinese people don't know his Chinese name, right?
He went by George everywhere. I mean, his family. Evidently, his family called him George. So it's kind of funny.
But on this topic of making connections with people by learning their names, this is something that you're just going to naturally run into over and over again is people's names. And so if you make the commitment early on to learn their Chinese names, just write it down in pinyin if you don't know the characters, then you're just slowly, naturally, organically adding vocabulary. And this actually worked really well for me over time. Like in the beginning, you're just like, this name's person is so hard. Like the characters of their given name are about like rosy clouds at the sunset. Like I'm not going to use that. Why am I learning this? But the thing is, a lot of these characters that are not common in everyday conversation are very common in names. So you'll start learning people's names, and then you'll learn names of new friends whose names are made up of the pieces of other people's names that you've already learned. And it all kinds of, it just kind of starts fitting together. And of course, the surnames repeat a lot more than the given names. But those given names, like building blocks, there's something that you want to accumulate over time as well. It's a type of vocabulary.
I have a story about this, John. I had a classmate in business school, and it's kind of funny. But before I went to China, I didn't obviously speak Chinese, and we called her Chong Chong. And that's what we called her. But when I got to China, she actually was from Shanghai, so I got to spend more time with her back in Shanghai after we had graduated. And my friend, I've mentioned him before, Von Wilhelm, he said, hey, her name is actually, it's a Cong Chong. And then I later on found out, like in talking with her, that the Cong, I don't know what character it is, but it's a rarely used character. And growing up all through grade school, that character didn't even come up in like the computers. It didn't come on the computer, I think, until maybe she got into college. So it was like her name, it was like Zhang Tong Tong or something. And actually that character was like a little X. If you've ever seen this happen in anything that's rendered in Chinese, it was like a box with an X in it. And that's what displays when the character isn't in the font set. So she always had that going on. And you'll have that where people have a very rare, uncommon character in their name just to try to be maybe a little different.
Yeah, I actually had a similar experience with a Chinese friend, one of my very first Chinese friends. She had this rare character in her name. And then I learned it because I was just learning all my friends' names. They appreciate it. It means a lot, and it helps me too, right? And then years later, I was in grad school at East China Normal University, and the professor's name had that character. And I knew it. And he's just like, whoa. I just got lucky there. I got lucky. I earned some points through just, random coincidence. But it does impress people when you can read their names.
On the same note, though, just about the characters that are used in the given names, if anyone has had Chinese friends, and maybe you might have had this discussion before, they might have asked you, say, what does your name mean? Now, for us in America, and I know many other of us, Western languages, European languages, we don't really give a lot of attention to the meaning of the name. For example, like Jared, I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's like Hebrew derivative and it means like flower or something. But like, you don't know that. It's not something you go around like really looking at and analyzing the etymology and the meaning of names. You focus more on the sound, right? And when you try to, and I've tried to explain this before to sometimes Chinese friends and colleagues, and they're like, "Well, why?" It's a little bit difficult for them to understand. But on the other hand, we are thinking like, why are you so focused on the meaning of the name? Where in Chinese, you can't make up like a new character. Again, we're coming back to that same thing. So they're using existing character elements that, of course, have a sound, but those characters have meaning. So when parents, and John, obviously, I want to hear you speak to this, but their parents in naming their children in Chinese, they're focusing not just on that sound, but also very focused on the meaning of that name.
Yeah, and it's not entirely because of characters. I mean, it's partly just because of the way people choose given names, right? And yeah, characters are the building blocks. But in Chinese, you have the given name, which can be anything, and the surname, which is a very limited set. So the given name is the parent's opportunity to, imbue some originality into their children. I mean, historically, a lot of Chinese people's names were kind of determined systematically according to their lineage. So it wasn't always so free and based on meaning as it is now. But it is kind of reversed because we have so many different surnames. And John, well, which John? Oh, John Pasden. And there's only like pretty sure there's only one living John Pazin in the world. Thanks to my surname, my name is unique. And then the Chinese, their name well, it's pretty hard to have a totally unique Chinese name with so many Chinese people in the world. But their name can be fairly unique, not at all because of their surname, but because of their given name.
Yeah. So, John, one question I like to ask you is, how do you know if your name sounds good in Chinese?
Well, you don't ask me, ask Chinese people. And you're not going to get a single response there. It's hilarious because Chinese people will often tell you that the Chinese name you chose is terrible and sounds bad. But then if you like pick a random Chinese person's name and ask other Chinese people if it's a good name, some of them will tell you it's terrible. And that's just that's the way it goes. Lots of opinions on names. But one of the things I think is interesting culturally when it comes to Chinese people's names is that the surname first, followed by the given name, the family name, followed by the individual name. It follows a larger pattern that you see all across Chinese culture, which is big to small. So whether it's an address, you start with the country, then the city, then the district, and the street, or whether it's a person's name, or whether it's like the time of day or the date. You start with the year, then the month, then the day. It's this really cool pattern that just goes across everything in Chinese culture, big to small, and it's good to kind of notice it.
I gotta say, side note, I love how addresses are written in Chinese. It makes so much more sense than what we do here in the West. Seriously.
I totally switched the way that I write dates, just for me personally, because like if you're using dates in like folders or file names, then putting the year first like auto sorts them when you put them in alphabetical order, which is a nice little perk.
I do that.
It's just smart.
It is.
All right, so we appreciate that. So anthropologists will tell you that, this is kind of a trend of like a collectivist culture versus a more individualist culture. But whatever, just be aware of those patterns because it will help you to know that. But here's another interesting thing about names, and I didn't even realize this until just recently when I was reading about it. Someone sent me a link, and that is that certain surnames are more common in certain regions of China. And you can even like look at like a heat map and see like where certain surnames are most common in China. And some of them have some pretty interesting connections. Like, for example, the surname Kong is common in Shandong, and Kongzi is Confucius, and he's from Shandong province.
There you go. That makes sense.
Yeah, or like Deng Xiaoping. Deng is common in Sichuan, and guess where Deng Xiaoping is from? Sichuan.
Sichuan. Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, we have that same type of dynamic. I know in America, there's going to be more Smiths in an area and then more Brewbagers or whatever the name is because, families grow up in those areas.
Norwegian names in Minnesota or whatever. Yeah, but in this case, everyone's Chinese, but there's still like, very clear patterns for the distribution of names in the country. But there's also another interesting thing, which if you're not in China, this can come in useful, which is when you meet a Chinese person, and if you've been studying Chinese for a while, or you like Chinese movies or Chinese history or whatever, you probably recognize a Chinese surname when you see it. But you can also tell by the way, well, kind of, sometimes. You can kind of tell by the way they spell their Chinese surname in English what part of China they're from. So if they're from Taiwan and their last name is Xu, they're not going to spell it XU. Most of the time, they're going to spell it HSU. Or if they spell their name WONG, not ANG, because WANG would be just pinyin, like mainland China pinyin. But WONG, which doesn't exist in Mandarin pinyin, then you know they're from Hong Kong, because like the surname Huang is written as WONG by most people from Hong Kong.
That's true. And I will say that, I can spot that right away. I think if you're around it enough and you get exposed to it, you're going to definitely start picking that up. And when you can tell someone, you say, oh, are you from Hong Kong or you're from Taiwan? Right away, they're like, oh, yes, how did you know? They're very appreciative of that.
Yeah, and if you've gotten pretty far in your studies and you know a lot of characters, then you can like look up like certain names like WONG Wong, like they can actually be a couple different characters, or like Jackie Chan, like CHAN. It can be a couple different characters, but you can kind of learn that, and that does impress people. I find that learning the names of like movie stars and historical figures, different types of celebrities. It can be another good way to pick up Chinese names that also lets you connect with Chinese people. Because a lot of times, like, Chinese people will know. Of course, everyone knows Jackie Chan is Changlong, but Chinese people know that. But there are some Chinese stars where they don't really know the English name, and they're telling you about this great movie star or whatever. You're like, oh, I've never heard of them, but actually you have. You just don't know their Chinese name. And so if you learn some of these Chinese names, then you can actually have these conversations and make these connections.
That's right. When you're able to connect on a pop culture level, that certainly allows it.
That is the highest level of friendship, Jared.
Pop culture friendship.
We Americans love to bond over TV shows. I've noticed this. It's kind of embarrassing, but
it's true.
Whether it was Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, now it's WandaVision, we just bond over these shows.
Or The Office.
Wow.
Come on,
you're watching WandaVision, right, Jared? You are watching.
Yeah, my family is. I don't know why. I just they started watching without me, and then it's like I have to watch 5 episodes to catch up, and whatever.
There's only 8 episodes out right now. Episode 9 is
okay.
coming.
See, I have 8 episodes to catch up, man. What kind of? I got to do podcasts, John.
All right. Okay, so I hope that this was interesting. In summary, learn Chinese people's names. It will help your Chinese, and it will help you form personal connections with Chinese people.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion. And today we want to talk about an excellent book which you may have never heard of. It is a breakthrough level book, only 150 unique characters, called Just Friends. 我们是朋友吗?
Just Friends. I love this story. I mean, it happened to be, I guess, one of my stories that I came up with. But I like this story. This was a fun story.
And this story is kind of relevant to today's topic because the characters in this story, they have very common Chinese surnames. Not super common, like 1 through 5, but still pretty common. They're all on that top 100 list, but they're all composed of like characters that are common in everyday speech as well. So if you even just go to the website and check out the introduction to the book, you can see the names and how they're quite common and useful names to know.
Now, side note on the story, I read this to my daughter. She loved the story so much that she keeps asking me, John, if we're going to do a sequel to this story.
Are we going to do a sequel?
I don't know. Maybe we will.
Well, let us know if you like the story because sequels are always a possibility. We never close the door on that one.
So Just Friends, Mandarin Companion, breakthrough level book. Uses only 150 basic characters. Go get it today on Amazon, iBooks, or Kobo, or wherever you get your books.
All right, so now it's time for Rants and Raves. Jared, I'll let you go first. What do you got?
All right. Today I have got a rant. And this relates to our discussion today. It's kind of it's not like really angry rant, but it's kind of a funny, a little cultural thing. So oftentimes if you're trying to fill out some sort of government form in China, or there's some sort of sign-up sheet that's usually been created by a Chinese person, and you got to put your name down, all right? There is this tiny little space that almost feels like it's, like a millimeters wide for you actually to write your name in. And my name is Jared Turner. It is Jared Turner. We got 4 syllables in there. It is not like this little short condensed, name space. Like you may be able to you know what I'm talking about, John. You can probably write John. That's it, right? Because in Chinese, we're saying your names are 2-3 characters, 4 at max, right? But
right.
I remember one time seeing this forum that some European individual had some last name like Buxenschutz or something, and it was like they were writing over all these other cells and bleeding through the form, and it was really difficult. So I don't know, that's a little bit of a rant, and okay, I understand you're in China, that's how it is, but I've seen that sometimes. I remember once I was doing a market research focus group, and as part of it we needed the people who were we had expats as part of this focus group, and the people had to come in and sign their name and sign in, And my assistant had created like this sheet for people to sign their names and put their names, and she did that. It was like 3 characters wide, little column for people to write their name. I'm like, no, this isn't gonna work. Like, these are like European people, these are foreigners. We can. She's like, oh yeah. Well, she didn't make the mistake again. But anyway, so that's a small little rant. It's actually more of something cute. That's more than an annoyance. But if anyone's been out there, you may have run into this same phenomenon.
Actually, Jared, I was going to do a rave, but now I want to piggyback on this rant. Can I tell?
All right, you're going to double down, all right?
Can I tell a little story? So last year, COVID hit China, and things got a little crazy pretty fast, right? And so we needed these health QR codes to get into a lot of public places. And you have to register for the health QR code in order to display it on your phone. And there were 3 possible apps you could do it through. You could do it through the official government app, through WeChat, or through Alipay. And I tried WeChat first because I use WeChat all the time. It didn't work because I had to put in my Chinese ID number, which I don't have. I only have a passport number. So then I tried the official government app. It didn't work. They didn't support passports. So then I was told, oh, you can use WeChat. So it's like, yes, you can use WeChat. It supports passports. But in order to use WeChat, I have to first connect my bank card. Because WeChat is a payment app, and you have to prove your identity with a bank account. So no problem. I have a Chinese bank account. I can do that, right? But every time I try to do that, they're like, "No, your name is wrong," and it wasn't wrong.
I know, it's just how the system reads it, right?
And it's because my bank account was really old, and at the time, they didn't support more than literally 6 characters. So in this system, I think it's 6 characters for your last name or something like that. So they had my surname as Pasde, and then instead of N, it was X. They made up a surname for me, and that was the surname I had to use in order to prove my identity. For using WeChat. So fortunately, I was able to clear it up by getting on the phone with the bank and eventually putting in the exactly right name. And I did get the QR code working on Alipay, but it's just one of those little funny things that happens when you're living in a society that was not made for you. But it's part of the fun of living in China, huh?
Oh, it is. That's all the banking systems. You're right. I have that same thing. I have different bank accounts, use my name in different ways because they import foreigners. One, it's last name, first name, middle name, all caps, no spaces. That's how it has to be put. If there's not the exact format, it doesn't accept it, right? You can't verify. It has to be all caps. So anyway, some fun things there about China.
It is getting better though. The bank now supports full names, but it didn't when I created the account. So it's getting better. China is getting more international. It's just it's got its own timeline for that. So we'll see how it goes.
And that's right. And I got to ask, is your system at work prepared to handle Chinese characters? Maybe not.
Ooh, it goes both ways, does it?
I gotta say, man, I've resurrected this old MMORPG game that used to play at City of Heroes. Anyone play that? I don't know, but I've tried to type Chinese characters in this. This was written it was made 15, 20 years ago almost now, and you can't even input Chinese characters into it. There you go. It's just not even possible. So, hey.
Well, actually, I play this mobile game called Marvel Strike Force, and we see Chinese names and Japanese names and Korean names in there all the time. So it's kind of cool. And then sometimes when people in my alliance are trying to target a certain enemy in one of our alliance raids or whatever, they're like, that Chinese character person. I'm like, oh, you mean this one? And I give them the name, and then they all copy it and paste it so they can target the person.
Well, maybe you should go by your Chinese name now.
Too late to change.
Too late, John.
So my name is Chris Marquis, and I am a professor at Cornell University's Business School.
Chris is a great example of how you can achieve that which you set your mind to.
And some of the research I do is on Chinese businesses. I teach a class on doing business in China.
As you listen to Chris's story, his motivation to learn Chinese lies somewhere near the intersection of purpose and curiosity, either of which can take you far. You also get some insights into how business is done in China.
Actually, I have another Sinica Sub-China podcast, China Corner Office. So, deep into understanding China and China business.
Stay with us. Well, Chris, we got to start with the big question. Why did you start learning Chinese?
The very first time I studied Chinese actually was in college. I took 1 year of Chinese, and it was really not great. It was right around 1989 when the Tiananmen situation happened. We had these orange books where I think we were learning a total of 400 characters for a whole year. I think, they're from the Chinese government, and I think they felt like Westerners couldn't learn learn Chinese. So it was really kind of bad.
So what kind of prompted you to pick it back up?
So I got a PhD in sociology, and my first job after that was at Harvard Business School, where I was for 10 years. And at my time at HBS, I had a chance to go spend a couple of months in Hong Kong. My research focus was very much around studying companies' environmentalism, social responsibility. And I said, hey, I have this old interest in China and Chinese. I should go into mainland China, interview companies, see what the situation's like there. That was, 2009 or so. And I did. And I just was like, wow. It really changed my life. I was like, if I'm going to study these issues of environmental sustainability, I really should be focused on China because the issues are so big, but also it really seems that the government was interested in changing at that point from just sort of growth at all costs to really balancing a little bit more sustainability and environmental protection. So I thought it was a great opportunity, and I loved being in China, loved Chinese food. So from that point on, all my research has been focused on China. And I felt to really do it justice, you have to learn Chinese. Many faculty that teach in business schools and teach on China actually don't speak Chinese. Very different than people in like history or sociology or, political science, where they've gone through Chinese studies programs where very deep in the language. I felt that, you really can't communicate with people. You can't research it effectively unless you can really study Chinese. And so, really over the past 10 years, I've been on a long journey of learning Chinese as a 40-year-old.
So tell me about this. What did you do at this stage? I imagine your life was really busy. You're a tenure track professor, you're publishing, right. You're teaching, you're researching, and now, hey, let's add one more onto this. Let's learn a new language.
And a lot of my colleagues thought I was sort of crazy, but this was about 5 years into my time as a professor. And I'd had a relatively productive first 5 years. I'd gotten the first promotion that professors get. And I figured, I should take on something new. Frequently, people take on something new after they get promoted in the next phase. Took Chinese classes with Harvard undergraduates. I did online programs. I lived about a half an hour from campus, and I would walk home and I'd listen to Chinese Pod and various other recordings. And then I started spending time in China. So, I realized actually through my work, I could get grants or teaching assignments. And I spent from probably 2005 to 2010, probably about 3 of those years actually in China. Being in the environment is really key.
Well, I want to hear about this. Can you think about some of these moments where you had some breakthroughs?
When people respond to me at times, so let's say order a DD. So like Uber, you call it, and Uber, you might sort of text with the driver, but DD, the driver immediately calls you to like confirm your location and ask any sort of certain pickup instructions. A couple times I have had this conversation, and then they're surprised when I'm not Chinese when I get to the car. Maybe they're just being polite or sort of flattering me or something like that.
Well, I'm curious to also know, like, you started learning like 20 years previous. And it sounds like the program was a bit different than what you started learning when you started picking up again 20 years later. And then actually you started going to China learning. What were some of the things that you found that before that weren't working out for you? And how did those change to what started working for you and helping you pick up proficiency in Chinese?
Back in the day, there was not good pedagogy around actually how to teach Chinese. I don't remember a lot about that. That was, again, sort of 1989 or so. But I remember, just when I restarted learning 20 years later and really didn't remember anything, maybe like ni hao or xie xie or something like that. It just felt like, wow, this is a much more comprehensive way to learn. And again, forcing you to be intensive about it, in every day, go to class. And this was something that I found to be really valuable to me. Obviously learning the Chinese, but also I think it's just for your brain to switch to a new thing is useful. So every day in the middle of my day, I was professor for a while. And then at 11 a.m., I'd walk over to the Chinese department and sit in a class for an hour. And I was a student and learning. And then just to get your mind out of it's almost like a meditation type of thing, because you have to focus so much on the Chinese that, you can't have all these stray thoughts that typically run through your mind.
I really admire this, that you say, hey, I'm going to do more research about China, so I'm going to learn Chinese. And you're right. There are a lot of other, it could be academics or just people who are China watchers that don't speak Chinese. So I want to kind of hear from your perspective. How has learning Chinese given you an advantage or more depth or insight into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think a big deal is relationships, in relationships beyond like Beijing and Shanghai. I do a lot of work actually in Chengdu, and I go to other places beyond Beijing, Shanghai. And let's say we're going to a meeting with, a leader of a company that maybe we're thinking about doing, a research case study or student project. I can have a meeting with them in Chinese. It helps because then people can relate to you in a much deeper way. And then, go to a lot of events in the evening where, drinking baijiu and having fun. That's sort of a joke, but there are a lot of events in the evening as well that I'm able to participate in that probably I wouldn't be able to participate in. And that's, for the research that I do, really understanding the nuances of how business is conducted is like really important, because a lot of it is with these large statistical databases. And, you might be able to find some statistically significant relationship, but if you can't understand the nuance and process underlying it, it's really not very worthwhile. And so really through a lot of these relationships and friendships that I've gotten to really understand the environment in a much deeper way, it's really enriched my research tremendously.
I totally understand what you're saying there about, people understanding those little nuances. I recall a few years ago, I read this blog post. This person was disputing that all of like Taobao and Alibaba's numbers about deliveries and stuff and packages were false because they couldn't compute. They said they were comparing it to like Amazon. They says, if this is true, then they'd have to have this many trucks and this many miles. They were basing all the numbers on like US experiences where I'm like, you fail to understand that, all the stuff's delivered on like electric bikes and, the population density, and you can go to one apartment building and deliver like 30 people's packages. Anyway, that's maybe not totally language, but it's understanding of things like how business is done, right?
Totally. You got to be there. And before COVID, actually, because of this center, I was going to China 5-6 times a year. That's really essential, I think, to be able to effectively sort of learn, research, write about things going on.
So, Chris, tell me then about some of the research that you're doing.
Sure. So, one set of papers that I've done relates to how the CCP affects business.
Chinese Communist Party. For our
Chinese
listeners.
Communist Party affects business. And so there's a lot of research that focuses on how business can get preferential access to things if they have some connection to the party, or maybe even it actually has negative effects because the party actually might extract various resources from the business. But the way that we're approaching it, the research team that I'm working with, is looking at how the early socialization experience of the entrepreneur or business leader in the party affects their longstanding business mindset and ideology. So what I mean by that is how the entrepreneur or even political leader, some of our work is looking at, had early experiences with the party. So when you join the party, you go through a long process of attending meetings, watching documentaries, writing self-criticisms, investigation in some ways of your family. Also, we look at people who have experienced the Great Leap Forward. So this was a period in the late 1950s, early 60s, where China tried to do some very rapid industrial advancement through collectivizing everyone and have everyone focus on this industrialization. And so like having your metal pans burnt down and stuff, unfortunately, big disaster and huge famine. And then also the Cultural Revolution, another difficult period, part of which there was this send down movement where students, like high school age students were sent from the cities, were sent to the countryside. Most famously, President Xi Jinping spent 7 years in some Shanxi, I think, village. And so what we look at is how these different experiences have longstanding effects on these entrepreneurs. So it turns out people that were socialized into the party before 1978 basically end up having a much more skeptical view to foreign companies. So they're less likely to take foreign investment, less likely to go abroad. Really interesting findings regarding Great Leap Forward. This is a time period where if you read some of the writings at the time, people had to boil belts to try to get some nutrition, boil leaves. Literally 30 to 40 million people starved. So, leaders that went through that are much more frugal in a variety of different ways. Interestingly, also, we find they're much more creative. So, this is something that, a company, Wanxiang, they make auto parts, big supplier to Ford, big supplier to GM. They recently purchased large battery companies in the US and have an electric car that's coming out. So the founder of Wanxiang, he said going through the Great Leap Forward, what's responsible for him making such creative products, because it required him to, make something out of nothing, like this experience of struggle day to day. And so these are the kind of things that we are studying, sort of this background of leaders in China, how these early experiences shaped them for a long time.
On that note, it'd be really interesting, I'll get, maybe this is a research idea, but, the impact of language. Because, one of the things that John and I talk about here on this podcast is that culturally and traditionally, Chinese did not all share one language. And it's still the case today. Or even say Mao Zedong, his Chinese was actually quite poor.
Right.
His Mandarin Chinese was not good. He spoke his own dialect.
Like Hunanese, yeah.
That's one thing that the Chinese government has done is, they've been able to bring everyone largely on the same page, unite everyone through language. But I would be interested to see how that has impacted business over the decades.
Yeah, really interesting. When I first started going to Hong Kong, and that was not that long ago, it was very hard to find Putonghua speakers. Everyone spoke Cantonese, but just in the last 10 years, it's really amazing how the focus on Mandarin has increased tremendously.
One of my first jobs in China was working in market research. And I quickly learned that if you wanted to do a nationwide survey for a product, you had to employ a patchwork and collection of local market research agencies. Things had to be locally translated. It was a huge challenge to collect information from the country as a whole.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think in the US, a lot of people have the perspective that China is this very top-down, authoritarian, Xi Jinping says it and it just happens immediately everywhere. And I think, that might partially be true, but I think the fragmentation, the local variation that exists in China is just tremendous as well.
Oh, yeah.
So it's sort of these two different poles of, both centralization and a lot of power in the central government, but then also, this huge variation. I think that anytime a company is trying to roll out a product, they have to do different things in Guangdong that they have to do in Beijing because, just the way those markets are, the way the people think, the consumer perceptions is just totally different in those locations.
It's so true. I mean, if you think about this, how hard can it be to get, a team, an organization, a company all on the same page? Well, now we got 1.4 billion people.
Right.
Some ethnicities and groups of people don't want to be part of China either. They want to keep their own autonomy or different things. So you got a lot of push and pull going on in that country.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, for its scope, it's very attractive, but it is a hugely complex market, let alone, obviously the language, but then also just the diversity is tremendous.
So how has your Chinese opened up some of those connections for you? I mean, has there been any projects or things you've been able to do because you spoke Chinese versus colleagues who didn't speak Chinese?
Sure. Certainly some of the events that I've taken part in, if I was not able to interact somewhat in Chinese, I would not be able to do it. So, I mean, I've given a few talks in Chinese.
So you have a lot of students I think students coming through don't recognize that a lot of faculty, their primary focus is research, right? And kind of teaching sometimes is a little kind of a secondary, right? But in your research, it's opened up a lot of doors for you and your eyes into a lot of things in China. But for your students that come through and ones who are interested in China, what kind of advice would you give to them?
I think it's go to China. I think that if you can go there, that's what the most important thing to do is, because like you were just saying, I mean, just some of the examples that you gave, if you're an analyst at Goldman Sachs and you're trying to analyze Taobao's sales and just basing it on the US and Amazon model, yeah, there's just no way to do it. I mean, so that nuance you have to get, I think, really from being there. One of my favorite things as a professor to do is take students to China. 4 or 5 times now, I've actually had a class where we actually go and spend 2 weeks visiting different companies, from Alibaba to C-Trip to sort of factories in Guangdong to NBA. We visited the NBA's headquarters in Beijing. Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had students that that's changed their lives. They've like, okay, wow, this has opened me to something so new and I want to pursue it. And then they end up getting a job in Shanghai or Hong Kong or something like that. I had one student, he was interested in finance. He was going to work for, I think maybe like JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley. And he gave that up and ended up moving to Hong Kong and working in the finance industry there. I think that for people that have never been to China, and probably most of your listeners have been to China, I assume, to go over, because the way that the media really shapes understanding of China, I mean, there is some discussion of how, advanced the infrastructure is, how there's tremendous wealth and tremendous poverty still. If you go to large cities, I mean, it's amazing, the wealth. Unless you can actually experience that, it's so mind-boggling to people. So when I take these students over, the ones that had never been to China, it's astounding. And it's interesting. One group of students that I frequently go on these trips are Indian students. And more than once, I've had Indian students be depressed a little bit. I've actually not been to India, so this is what they've related to me. They expect it to be like the level of the infrastructure and wealth to be around India level, which is many steps below it. I mean, I don't want to generalize about India.
I can relate. I've been to India before, and I think I was expecting maybe something a little similar to China. But yeah, I was surprised to see the infrastructure was not as robust. It's just the simple things. You're like no sidewalks or curbs. That's a small thing, but I didn't see those. Right. And I was in a tech town of Hyderabad. Yeah. There's a lot of money there, but there's, again, a lot of poverty.
Right. No, and I think they come on this trip and they're just blown away. And I think they are, a little worried about India's ability to compete with China, given how far advanced the China infrastructure and other things along those lines seem.
I remember my first time coming to China. I don't know exactly what I expected. I think I was expecting maybe like some dirt roads and mud huts, but not exactly. But then it was like a city like New York, on a whole grand different scale. It was like, whoa, this place, it's amazing.
It's amazing, but then also, at the same time, it's the city like New York, but then you can see some poor man with a 3-wheel cart with, cardboard piled very high, where that's recycling is sort of the income that he might achieve. So it's a lot of dichotomies, but tremendous infrastructure. I mean, it's really amazing.
This is really interesting, Chris. So I would ask this one question then. If you could go back and do things differently in regards to learning Chinese, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I would spend more time on tones. Maybe also like some advice that I've gotten sort of along the way from other people. And these are mostly actually Chinese people who become very good at English. Some of the people have never actually left China and their English is like as good or better than mine, which is sort of amazing. Mm-hmm. They, how did you do it? So they, one person told me they actually focus a lot on sentences. So being able to learn and memorize sentences, maybe that's something I would have focused on a little bit more, sort of really trying to learn a lot of more fluid sentences. Also, someone gave me this really good advice. Focus on Chinese every day, even if it's only 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And over the past year, actually, I've sort of redoubled my interest and effort in learning Chinese, and I've really made that my goal. So every day I do some Chinese, And I've really been trying to advance my Chinese. I think after that time period where I was in China up to 2015, when I came back, I used a variety of different methods to try to maintain it. I think when you try to maintain things, it declines naturally. I think that, it's good to be trying to learn new vocabulary, learn new sentence patterns. I think trying to study every day and also, really trying to continue advancing. I wish that like the period from 2015 to 2019 or 20, I'd focused on advancing as opposed to just maintaining.
Oh, that's really good advice. It's almost like the thing about a fish in a stream, unless you're actively swimming upstream, you're going to be floating downstream, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
That's great. Well, Chris, thanks so much for being on this podcast. If people want to find out more about you and they want to listen to your podcast, where can they go?
Sure. So for the podcast, the China Corner Office podcast, I have a website, my name, chrismarquis.com, and they can learn more about my various other sort of research.
Well, all right, Chris. Well, thanks so much. We appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Jared.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, printer, author, scholar, handyman, food blogger, tax preparer, sign linguist, and that one guy named Will. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Kuo at SupChina. An interview editor is with James Harper with Filter Productions. I'd like to thank our guest, Chris Marquis, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.